you very much for coming today. I'm going to talk about the power of curiosity. Um, Curiosity is something at that sort of runs through our agency. It's the name of the process that we use for everything that we do. And it's even a requirement and a way that we screen and recruit people for their inherent levels of curiosity. So we know that it's something that works for us as an agency. But we wanted to understand whether or not the power that we see for us in terms of these curious people has an impact on brands as well. So being curious, we decided to go out and field some research. We interviewed 15,000 people around the world, and we asked them essentially what it meant for them. What is curiosity? What is it to them? And then the role that brands can play in that and what the potential impact can be. And that's really what I want to talk about today. I mean, firstly, we found that the power of curiosity is really turned on today more than it's ever been in the past. You can see it in data from places like Google. This is just looking at the number of people who are searching with the word why in it. People are using technology to try and satisfy their curiosity at levels never before seen. And they tell us this too. We asked them, two-thirds of the people we talked to said curiosity is something that is easier for them to come by today than it's ever been before. 9 out of 10 people say it's an advantage to them. It's something that actually really helps them. And 3/4 of the sample are saying that it's something that's becoming really more important over time. So there's a lot of momentum around curiosity in people. And 76% of the people we talked to actually said they were curious. So it's interesting about who the 24% are who will admit that they're not curious in a survey. There's maybe a whole separate presentation on those people, but most people say that they are curious, and there are different degrees to that, obviously, and we're currently working through sort of a segmentation, actually, around different levels of curiosity, but essentially most people believe that they are curious people. So I want to talk about 3 things. Firstly, I want to dig a little bit into this idea of curiosity and what it means. Secondly, I want to talk about what it means from a brand perspective. What are the principles of curious brands? And you'll see in a second why that's important. And then thirdly, I just want to briefly touch on how do you actually make this real and do something about it. I'm not a big fan of doing research that just sits there and is interesting but not actionable. So how can you really take advantage of this and start thinking differently about your consumers through this filter? So hopefully in the 20 minutes, I'll be able to do this. Firstly, the thing that we found about curiosity is it's not just a word, but it's actually a defining value of a group of people. And those people are really disproportionately valuable to your brand. What do we mean by that? They're 118% more likely to interact with a brand online. They're 102% more likely to recommend brands to other people. And essentially, they're 58% more likely to actually buy a brand that is tapping into their curiosity. And I'll talk in a second about what we mean by that and how that works. But essentially, this idea that there is a huge untapped potential value here for brands that can understand their consumers' curiosity and how they can play a role in that. 4 times more likely to be curious a brand who is curious about them. So this idea of you have these people who are curious and they're more likely to interact and engage with brands that reflect some of that curiosity back on them. So brands who are paying attention or an interest in me, I'm more likely to want to interact with them. I'm more likely to recommend them. I'm more likely to buy them. And that's that real potential untapped value that we're talking about when you can understand that relationship. So what is a curious brand, right? So if we're saying that curious brands that behave curiously are ones that can tap into that potential, what does it actually mean to be a curious brand? Well, essentially it just obviously means the same thing as being a curious person, right? We ask people, who do you think are the most curious people in society today? Scientists, not surprisingly. We asked most curious brands, and it was the big 3 technology brands that came up as being the most curious. Interestingly, though, number two were about journalists and artists. So more of a design idea, people like Coke and IKEA, Nike. These were brands that people were saying are really pretty curious in the world. Anyone have any idea what the least curious profession was, systematically worldwide? Anyone? Politicians. Routinely rated last in terms of curiosity in every market that we looked at. We actually did ask about marketers as well, and we were right in the middle. So I don't know if that's good or bad, but it's not politicians. So these are some of the brands and the people that people think are inherently curious. But we wanted to dig a little bit deeper and say, well, what does curiosity really mean to you, right? So, okay, we understand some of the brands and the people that you think are curious, but what does it actually mean to you to be curious? And we got some interesting answers, and we got kind of a range of answers that fell into distinct quadrants. So on the first point, we had markets where basically it was pretty a rational idea. So curiosity to me is really about finding out the truth at any cost. This is a quote from somebody in the UK. And this is this sort of rational, it's how I get an answer, was really the theme that came up from this cluster of markets, and I'll show you the clusters in a second. On the other hand, we had people and markets where curiosity was much more about personal advancing and success. So this was somebody in China talking about curiosity to them was how they become more successful. It's the way that they can advance themselves through their careers and through life. On the other hand, we had markets where curiosity, and this is a quote from somebody in the UAE, was about trying to find out things that are being hidden from them. So this idea that they're not necessarily aware of everything that's going on in the country, and curiosity is how they start to uncover more about that. And then lastly, we had this idea about how curiosity was something that just catches your attention, makes you smile. So it's less rational than some of those markets, and it's more emotional, and it's more about really sort of playful almost. So these were four distinct definitions, if you like, of what people told us curiosity meant to them. And you could sort of cluster these markets. These are the 15 markets we looked at. You have in those rational sort of areas, you have Germany and the UK. In that sort of inspirational idea, we're in Italy. Italy was in that market, as did the US. The progress markets were the BRIC markets, not surprisingly. Japan is an interesting one that sits in there, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And then in the challenge markets, where this was really about overcoming or finding out things that you wouldn't necessarily know, the UAE, but also Australia, which is slightly bizarre, and we're digging a little bit more into what that really means at this point. But it's interesting how the same themes and the connection there, it really did exist in those markets. There's a pretty distinct clustering when we looked at how people were responding to that question. So, we now understand a little bit about what it means to be curious and how that differs around the world. We know that there's a value in brands being able to operate in that space where it's satisfying or creating or advancing curiosity for their consumers. So how do you take advantage of that? We wanted to look at sort of three broad principles that we think if brands behave in this way, they can really tap into that. First one, be more Japanese. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, I showed you that Japan was a bit of an outlier on that market map I talked to you before. And it's very interesting the way the Japanese talk about curiosity. Firstly, they are uniformly the number one market outside of, when we interview people, outside of people saying, my own market is the most curious in the world, everyone picks Japan as being the number two most curious market. There's something interesting going on there. When we asked people what curiosity meant to them, it was this idea of real sort of vitality or lifeblood. Again, no, this never really came up in any other market other than Japan. And further, there are people just asking or coming forward with answers that were completely different in this market than others. So whereas in most markets, people define curiosity as looking for answers to a question that you have, in Japan, it's more about discovering new questions to ask. It's a slightly different way of thinking about it. instead of researching things before deciding to buy them, which was really the trait of most markets in Japan and some of the other BRIC markets, about trying new things without fear. So there's a slightly different way that Japan is thinking about curiosity, and that obviously has an implication for brands. So when we say be more Japanese, essentially what we're saying is really try and set a high bar in terms of, is this new, or am I just stuck in a rut? Am I just trying something over and over again? Real obsession over the details. If you look at what people talk about and show examples of curiosity in Japan, it's very design-oriented, and it's very focused and disciplined. It's really interesting. And there's a combination of art and design and utility, which I think is very interesting there. And really, acting as if the future is here today. The technology trends in Japan are amazing. So I think when we say be more Japanese, I think this is essentially what we're saying. There's some of these traits that a brand can tap into. The second one, be more generous. What do we mean by that? So we asked people, we did a classic research game where we said, if you were the brand manager of a brand and you were trying to demonstrate that you were a curious brand to your consumers, what would you do? And almost uniformly, people talked about giving back, about investing in areas that were giving back to society in general. Most people talked about science and technology as being an area that, if a brand showed that they were investing in those areas for society, that they would come across as a more curious brand and people would be more likely to be interested in buying them. There are some slight differences in China and Japan. People talk about the environment as being kind of the number one topic, that if a brand can have that conversation in that area, will benefit them as being a curious brand. And then in some markets, it's around education as well. So supporting things and supporting causes is something that people think is really a powerful characteristic of a curious brand. And talking about it, we talked about how you would, if in this fictional I'm a brand manager role, where would you spend your money? Well, a lot of it is doing good things, but it's also about telling people that you're doing good things. So it's not being sort of shy about it. It's actively marketing your brand as something that is involved in some of these causes and is really caring, and then there will be a benefit to the brand as a result of that. So that's the second principle. The last principle, be more G. What do we mean by that? Lady Gaga, I don't know if anyone knows who that is on the right. It's a guy called G-Dragon. I'll talk about him in a second. But Lady Gaga, I think, is a great example of somebody who has taken a very active control of her own brand in terms of inviting in fans and her fans to help shape her brand itself. So she has a community called the Little Monsters, and she is always getting feedback from them. They are actively involved in the creation of who her brand is and how it changes over time. It's really fascinating. G-Dragon has sort of taken that to the next level. He's a K-pop star. I'm not a huge expert on K-pop, but apparently it's this massive phenomenon throughout Asia. And he has taken the Lady Gaga concept and has made it very one-to-one, meaning he's using a lot of these web-based, mobile-based chat apps in Asia. He's having one-to-one conversations with his fans, and they absolutely love him. And he's a massive, massive star in Asia, and a lot of it is because he's taken some of those principles and he's really pulled his fans in, and they feel very, very close to him because of that. So when we say really, what do we mean by, when we say be more G, what are we talking about? Well, it's about empowering the community. So I think it's about finding a way that you can provide a forum for your fans and brand fans to actually contribute. And then actually taking some of that and reflecting that back in the way that the brand talks to those fans and talks to their consumers. And doing that in a very personalized way. We see a lot of information, especially when you start talking to teens, about personalization from a brand perspective is very powerful and is a way for them to sort of stand out more through the brand as a sort of an extension of who they are. So those are essentially the Be More G criteria. Lastly, I mean, again, I think, this is interesting in theory, but then how do you really actually make this actionable? I think the trick here is to look for ways to operationalize and engage these people. They're avid media consumers. So they're already, on average, using or consuming 18 more hours a week of media. So there is an opportunity for media to really be that intersection between the curious consumer and the curious brand. And media can be a way to activate that intersection. This is just an example. We have this data. We can cut it by any particular either demographic or this is a millennials cut that we looked at. But the idea is to start really drilling into the data, identify the market, the demographic that you're interested in, understand what's really their unique way of being curious and the behaviors that they exhibit. And then the media that they consume, and how can you forge that intersection and use media to tap into the things that they're saying are really important. This is an example for Italy, where there's this really interesting thing in this market. We talked before about how curiosity in Italy was very much about art and science and the emotion around that. And the idea of brands being able to tell stories that are this mix of sort of philosophy and art as well as product is sort of an interesting idea that's almost unique to this particular market. So that is the preliminary set of findings from the research. We're really just starting to dig into this. There is a segmentation that's going on right now where we can start to drill further into who are the, how does curiosity really change over time and by age, and so I think there's some really fascinating stuff to come from that. We are about to launch our Wave 8, which is the 8th year of our social media tracking study, coming up in the next few months, and this curiosity thinking is going to really channel into that so that we can start to see the devices and the technology that people are really using to satisfy some of this curiosity and how that changes over time as well. So thank you very much. 20 minutes.